a glass of ice water, a strip of rubber, and a famous physicist about to embarrass NASA on national television. Richard Feynman dunks the rubber into the ice, waits, then presses it between his fingers. It doesn't spring back. It stays crushed, rigid, brittle, useless. He looks up and says, "This is what the O-rings experienced on launch morning." The room goes silent, because in less than a minute, Feynman exposed the simplest truth of the entire disaster. Cold made the shuttle seals fail. Any engineer could see it. Any manager could understand it. So the real mystery isn't the physics. It's the decision. If the danger was this obvious, why did NASA launch anyway? To answer that, we have to rewind to the night before the flight, when the engineers issued the clearest warning of their careers, and the people in charge chose to ignore it. For the first minute of flight, Challenger looked perfect. At liftoff, the shuttle cleared the tower and began rolling onto its ascent trajectory. But within the first second of ignition, a thin puff of black smoke slipped from a joint on the right solid rocket booster. It lasted only a fraction of a second, easy to miss on the broadcast, but it was the first sign that the booster seal had failed to seat correctly. For the next 40 seconds, the climb appeared normal. Hidden inside that joint, though, hot gases were cutting a microscopic path through the gap. At T plus 58 seconds, that flaw finally broke open. A needle-thin jet of flame burst through the booster's side, angled outward like a blowtorch. The jet was pointed directly at the shuttle's external tank, the massive orange cylinder holding more than 500,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen. At T plus 64 seconds, the flame punctured the tank skin. 9 seconds later, the tank collapsed, overwhelmed by internal pressure and the aerodynamic forces of high-speed ascent. Challenger didn't explode. It tore apart, shredded by forces no vehicle could survive. The familiar white cloud wasn't a fireball, but the violent release of cryogenic fuel as the structure disintegrated. The crew cabin separated intact. It continued upward briefly, then arced into a long fall lasting 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Inside, 3 personal air packs were activated. Someone was still conscious. But here's the part almost no one knew that morning. The night before, engineers had tried to stop this launch, and they warned exactly what would fail. 8:45 p.m., January 27, 1986. In a small conference room at Morton Thiokol in Utah, Roger Boisjoly spreads photographs across a table. Burned hardware, eroded seals, blackened scoring from past missions. He isn't guessing. He's showing history. The O-rings have been struggling for years. Cold weather stiffened them, slowed their response, made them fail to seal during ignition. And the forecast for launch morning was worse than anything the shuttle had ever seen. Boisjoly points to the data. At 53 degrees Fahrenheit, we had blow by. Then he circles a number on a chart. Tomorrow morning, 26. Beside him, fellow engineers nod. They've seen the pattern too many times. Each time the shuttle flew anyway, NASA quietly reclassified the damage as acceptable. Not because it was safe, because nothing bad had happened yet. And tonight, that past was finally catching up. On the phone are NASA managers in Florida. The shuttle program is already behind schedule. Press coverage is arranged, and the nation is expecting its first teacher in space. Every delay is public. Every scrub is political. Thiokol's engineering team makes their recommendation. Do not launch. Silence follows. Then NASA pushes back, not with data, but with doubt. How can you prove the O-rings will fail tomorrow? It's the question that flips the burden of proof, and every engineer on the call hears the shift. Safety protocol requires proving a launch is safe. Tonight, NASA wants them to prove it's unsafe. Confusion turns to tension. Voices tighten. Charts are re-explained. Past failures are repeated. Boisjoly's tone stays calm, but inside he feels it, the floor tipping. Then NASA asks for something impossible, a recommendation to proceed. Thiokol's senior managers call a caucus, an offline, private meeting. The engineers are dismissed from the room. 5 minutes pass. 10. 20. No one returns. After 30 minutes, the managers re-enter the conference room, and Joe Kilminster speaks the words that end the debate. We recommend proceeding with the launch. Boisjoly freezes. He doesn't argue. None of the engineers do. The decision is made. 12 hours later, the world will see what that decision looked like. On launch morning, the warnings weren't buried in documents or hidden inside engineering charts. They were on the launch pad, visible to anyone with a camera. Hours before ignition, technicians walking the service structure reported something no shuttle should ever launch with: ice everywhere. Sheets of it clung to handrails. Icicles dripped from the swing arms. Metal surfaces were glazed and brittle. The O-rings that engineers had warned about just 12 hours earlier weren't merely cold. They were below their tested threshold. The seals would be stiff, slow, unable to respond. It was the exact scenario the engineers had modeled, except now it wasn't theoretical. It was physically attached to the vehicle. But when Challenger lifted off, the ice transformed into a different kind of warning, a warning most viewers didn't recognize. As the shuttle climbed, the exhaust plume from the right solid rocket booster began to deform. A healthy SRB produces a tight, symmetrical flame. But Challenger's booster showed a curved, uneven plume, a distortion caused by escaping hot gases bending the main exhaust flow. On live TV, the difference looked like turbulence. To booster specialists, it meant something was leaking where no gas should ever escape. Then, a few seconds later, another signature appeared, a small, flickering glow along the booster's side. Engineers would later call it torching, a thin jet of flame cutting through the joint like a blowtorch, burning the rubber O-ring into hydrocarbon soot. The very seal that was supposed to protect the booster was being consumed by it. None of these clues triggered an abort, not because they weren't real, but because the system wasn't designed to treat visible anomalies as hard constraints. Flight rules were built around numbers, pressures, temperatures, engine readings, not around smoke, ice, or a plume that looked a little off. The evidence was there. The physics were there. The warnings were visible. So how did a space agency built on precision learn to treat clear signs of danger as acceptable risk? To answer that, you have to step outside the launch footage and inside the culture that shaped the shuttle program. The shuttle didn't fail in a vacuum. It failed inside an engineering culture that had quietly rewritten the definition of acceptable risk. And the most dangerous part? It happened so gradually that almost no one noticed. Inside NASA, the O-ring erosion problem wasn't new. It had appeared on earlier missions, sometimes a small burn mark, sometimes a partial seal erosion. Each time, the shuttle still reached orbit. Each time, the post-flight memos grew more comfortable calling erosion a known anomaly. That phrase sounds harmless. In reality, it was a psychological trap. When a flaw shows up repeatedly, without causing an immediate catastrophe, the human brain begins to treat it as safe. NASA engineers later gave this a name: normalization of deviance, a slow drift from strict standards toward riskier ones, justified by the simple fact that nothing bad happened last time. By the time Challenger rolled onto the pad, deviance wasn't an exception. It was a workflow. Managers faced immense pressure. A presidential speech tied to a teacher in space, tight schedules, political promises, budget constraints, and a launch cadence NASA had never achieved before. The shuttle was supposed to fly like an airline. Quick turnarounds, minimal delays. Every scrub looked like a failure. So when engineers said the cold made the O-rings unsafe, managers didn't ignore the warning. They reinterpreted it. If we've flown with erosion before, they reasoned, then erosion must be within acceptable limits. The data didn't change. The threshold for danger did. And that shift is why the visible clues on launch morning, ice, plume distortion, torching, didn't trigger a halt. The culture had learned to treat anomalies as tolerances, not warnings. But Challenger's breakup forced the entire world to confront what NASA had been rationalizing for years, which leads to the final truth the investigation uncovered. The disaster didn't end at T+73 seconds. It started long before launch, and its consequences extended far beyond the smoke trail over the Atlantic. The Rogers Commission didn't take long to find the heart of the failure. Their conclusion was blunt. The O-rings failed exactly as engineers had warned, and the launch decision process was fatally flawed. But the moment that broke through NASA's defenses wasn't a chart or a memo. It was a confrontation. During one hearing, NASA managers defended the launch as within acceptable risk. They argued that previous O-ring erosion had not caused catastrophic failure, so the data still supported the decision. Richard Feynman interrupted them. He didn't redo the ice water test you saw in the opening. He didn't need to. He held up a hardened piece of rubber and said, with quiet disdain, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations." Everyone in that room understood what he meant. NASA hadn't miscalculated. They had rationalized. And the people who had tried to stop the launch paid a price long after the hearings ended. Roger Boisjoly returned to Thiokol to find colleagues refusing to speak to him. He was reassigned away from flight hardware. In later interviews, he admitted, "I was made to feel like I betrayed my company, when all I did was try to save 7 lives." The guilt and isolation broke him. He took medical leave. He never returned to his old position. The commission recommended sweeping changes, safety offices, management restructuring, redesigned O-rings. NASA promised a new culture. But 17 years later, Columbia was lost, Again, after engineers warned of danger and were ignored. So here's the real question for you. Do you think organizations like NASA truly change after tragedies? Or do the same patterns just hide better? Type changed or hiding in the comments. And that brings us back to the mystery we opened with. Feynman's ice water test took 60 seconds. It could have been done the night before launch. It could have been done a year earlier. The physics were simple. The failure wasn't that NASA didn't know the O-rings stiffened in cold. The failure was that no one in the chain of command thought the simplest question was worth asking. That's what doomed Challenger. Not ignorance, but certainty.